Welcome back. Last week, we spent our time together in our video lectures discussing the rise of gay liberation. We discussed some key contextual social movements that really created the foundation for the emergence of gay liberation, some key moments of confrontation and challenge in the 1960s, the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, and then subsequently the rise of gay liberation politics. This week, we're going to shift our view away from gay liberation a bit to think about the increasing growth and visibility of gay and lesbian communities in particular, the rise of gay liberalism as a political philosophy. We'll start there first. And then also the ways in which people of color and trans communities continue to organize and their relationships to both gay liberation and also gay liberalism. And in making this shift this week, which will largely focus on the 1970s and the early 1980s, I in no way mean to suggest that gay liberation does not continue to be a potent and powerful movement. Indeed, that's true for really the first 3/3 of the 1970s. And we'll talk a bit in week 12 when we really focus on the HIV/AIDS crisis about the ways in which some of gay liberation's key tenets end up becoming increasingly visible and actually used by AIDS activists to challenge the heterosexism within both the treatment of people living with HIV and AIDS and also in various forms of governmental neglect of communities living with HIV and AIDS. So more on that in week 12. And so now let's turn to gay liberalism. So what is gay liberalism? In some way, it's a bit challenging to understand gay liberalism without having those earlier reference points of gay liberationist ideology and also homophile politics. And you'll remember that last week I had that moment where I did a kind of compare and contrast between homophile political organizations and mobilizations, which tended to be much more politically conservative, much more invested in gender respectability and sexual respectability, very committed to visibility by sort of key decision makers, journalists, medical practitioners, members of government, etc. And also largely dominated by white cisgender Americans. Gay liberation, as you'll remember, was a much more expansive movement when it came to their political aims. It was not solely about equality for gay, lesbian, and trans Americans. Rather, it was about liberation for a whole host of individuals marginalized and oppressed by various systems. So gay liberation was deeply committed to challenging patriarchy, racism, heterosexism, various forms of class inequality, very deeply invested in thinking about transnational movements and forms of solidarity, right? So not just thinking insularly about political movements in the United States. And that also gay liberation was very confrontational in its tactics, very deeply committed to sexual and gender liberation, etc. And that also the demographics of that movement, while continuing to be majority kind of white cis Americans, also had a fairly visible and important contingent of people of color, gender nonconforming, and trans folks, etc. Okay. So this week, as we shift to gay liberalism, I think it's going to feel a bit like a shift back or in more of the direction to homophile politics. So what is gay liberalism? I define gay liberalism as a political movement that focuses by and large on issues related to lesbian and gay initially, and then sort of later as we move into the late 90s and early 21st century, bisexual and transgender equality rooted in law, policy, commerce, and public perception. And so I offer that definition to really signal the ways in which individuals who organize under the banner of gay liberalism are much less interested in this expansive idea of liberation from various systems of oppression, are not necessarily less dedicated to coalitional politics, but those coalitions look very different. So this is to signal the ways in which gay liberals are interested in a much narrower set of issues, right, as being their primary focus. And so let's think a bit about what makes gay liberalism distinctive. So on the one hand, their rhetoric is distinctive. So it's not only that gay liberal organizations, of which I'll name a few in a moment, are much more narrowly interested in issues that affect, right, especially at this time, lesbian and gay Americans in law, policy, commerce, and public perception. It's also that the rhetoric they use is much less, it's certainly not intersectional by and large. It's also not thinking about systemic oppression or systemic inequality, and instead is mobilizing a lot of rhetoric around kind of minority group civil rights, about privacy, and about rights to participate in the capitalist marketplace and property ownership, right? All very important issues, but ones that by and large in these organizations' formulations are deemed to be separate from liberation or wholesale articulations of social transformation, right? They're not interested in upending society in a whole host of ways. Two, gay liberal organizations tended to demographically be very homogenous. They tended to be staffed and populated by middle class, gender normative white Americans. There's, especially in the early years, a very heavy preponderance of cis men in these organizations, and later cis women who identify as gay men and lesbians, respectively. Moreover, in terms of the scale of these organizations, one of the things that perhaps I didn't say last week about gay liberation organizing is that oftentimes these are groups that are really interested in grassroots organizing, in organizing local communities and having, at times, anti-hierarchical formation and structure. Gay liberal organizations, by and large, are not like that. They rely heavily on paid staffers who become kind of gay rights professionals in this moment. They rely heavily on professional fundraising, which takes up a lot of time and energy for these organizations. They also are very interested in lobbying at the federal level, but also at the state and local level as well. And also there's a kind of centralized decision making, right? So these are very hierarchical organizations that really are mirroring other kind of civil rights, labor, women's rights organizations at the time who are seeking to access kind of mainstream political corridors of power. So if we've talked a bit about rhetoric and focus, demographics and scale, the other thing to highlight are their strategies. So remember that for gay liberation organizations, they're very interested in these disruptive, kind of performative forms of civil disobedience, taking over the offices of the Ladies' Home Journal and sitting outside of a diner that refused to serve certain patrons, right? Engaging in various forms of theatrics that were incredibly visible. The strategies of these gay liberal organizations in general are really not that theatrical, are not that transgressive. Instead, these organizations are very interested in trying to change public opinion and change the opinion of those in power through lobbying, through building personal relationships with lawmakers, through utilizing existing public forums like the press or television. They also are very interested in forming alliances, not with radical organizations like the Black Panther Party, for example, or other grassroots organizations, but are really interested in forming alliances with moderate political organizations that have a lot of clout. So organizations like NOW, the National Organization for Women, organizations like the National Education Association, the AFL-CIO, or the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, right? These are powerful organizations by the 1970s who have, millions of members, have, multi-million-dollar budgets, and are incredibly influential within the base of the Democratic Party. And so that's the other thing to perhaps say about gay liberal organizations during the 1970s and the first part of the 80s is that this is the moment in which what would become kind of mainstream gay liberal organizations are very interested in becoming a part of the Democratic Party, right? And this kind of Democratic Party coalition, and also a coalition of civil rights organizations. That would include some of the ones I mentioned now, AFL-CIO, the National Education Association, but also the NAACP, the National Urban League, etc. So, what were some of the key organizations that we might associate with gay liberalism? Some of them are going to sound familiar. So, the National Gay, later Lesbian Task Force is founded in 1973. The Gay Rights National Lobby is founded in 1976, as is an organization that might be familiar to some of you, the Human Rights Campaign, which is founded in 1970. And indeed, later on, the Gay Rights National Lobby and the Human Rights Campaign actually merge into one organization and are known under the name of the Human Rights Campaign. And then finally, there's the Lambda Legal Defense Fund in 1973. And so by depicting these organizations as being a bit more narrow in their political focus and philosophy, a bit more homogenous than gay liberation organizations, and a bit and not necessarily dedicated to certain forms of social transformation, that is not to detract from the very important work that these organizations did in the 1970s and early 80s, and many of them continue to do in the present day around trying to dismantle this heterosexual, homosexual binary in American life and law. So these are very important organizations that are doing a lot of important work. However, in comparing them to gay liberation, one of the things that I want to make clear for all of us is how communities organized around, any shared set of identities will understandably experience tensions around needs, around political organizing, around membership. And so what we're seeing in this 1970s, early 80s moment is how a number of those tensions that I mentioned last week in gay liberation around, sexism and patriarchy, around kind of normative understandings of sex and gender are really causing a kind of splintering of political organizing. And with that, I'll stop lecture 10A. And in our next lecture, we'll turn very briefly to people of color organizing and trans organizing in the 1970s.